let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump. There's never been anybody else like him in terms of his background and his personality.
When people said, oh, he's fascist, he's horrible, he's Hitler, people said, no, he's not. I know that guy. I watched him on The Apprentice. I watched him in Home Alone 2 or Sex and the City.
How do you think Israel and the war on Hamas is impacting the 2024 election?
I think the average American is pro-Israel because they're pro-civilization against barbarism, and I think we really shouldn't lose sight of that.
Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week, as the nation reeled from an attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump on the eve of Republicans nominating him for the 2024 race, we have a fascinating conversation for you with presidential historian Tevi Troy. But before we begin, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Leadership matters. That's an idea that generations of Marxist historians dismissed as an obsolete great man theory of history that should be replaced by studies of mass movements, economic and sociological forces that supposedly dwarf the ability of any one individual, no matter how impactful. But no matter how ideologues have tried to convince us to ignore the evidence, the truth remains that individuals and qualities of leadership make an enormous difference in deciding the fate of nations as well as the course of history. So if Americans are only starting to pay close attention to the 2024 presidential race in the last few weeks as a disastrous debate performance, an attempted assassination, and the first of the two major party conventions was held, there's no denying that a lot is on the line in this American presidential election. Love him or hate him, divine providence seemed to be on the side of former President Donald Trump, as age first seemed to have laid low his opponent, President Joe Biden, and then a slight movement of his head saved him from an assassin's bullet while giving a speech in Butler, Pennsylvania. But the confirmation of the consensus about the importance of the individual in history is the almost obsessive focus of Trump's opponents on trying to define him as not merely the epitome of evil, indeed another Adolf Hitler, but also gifted with nearly magical powers to mesmerize a party and a country to the point where, by the force of his will alone, he will, according to them, take down a 248-year-old constitutional republic and replace it with some morbid dystopian authoritarian fantasy. While his opponents accuse Trump supporters of supporting a cult, the over-the-top reactions he provokes from opponents and their willingness to engage in conspiracy mongering, as with the Russian collusion hoax, big tech and corporate media efforts to censor negative stories about Biden, and now a campaign of lawfare aimed at bankrupting and imprisoning Trump, seems more a confirmation that they seem to have an almost otherworldly faith in his powers. It's true that Trump has transformed the GOP into a party that is less interested in Wall Street and more attuned to the needs of working-class voters. But it can also be argued that this change is no more astonishing than the way the Democrats have ceased representing the interests of workers and adopted Wall Street with their support for illegal immigration and globalist economics that has impoverished many of their former voters. It's equally true that during the power of the individual that has been shown in two presidencies of Trump and Biden, as the former had the will, rooted in his contempt for the expert class, to transform Middle East policy, while the latter's weakness has been responsible for the chaos in Eastern Europe and the Middle East on his watch. But the contrasting symbolism of Biden's fumbling public performances and Trump's triumphant defiance after surviving a murder attempt captured in an iconic photograph and viral video may sum up the election this year more than any contrast in their policy positions. To discuss this unique election and to try to place it in historical perspective, we're fortunate to have with us someone who is one of the finest presidential historians we have today. Tevi Troy is a senior fellow and director of the Presidential Leadership Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a senior scholar at Yeshiva University's Strauss Center, and a former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services and senior White House aide. He is also the author of 4 books, including Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump, Intellectuals and the American Presidency, Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House, and a new book that will be out in just a few weeks, Power and the Money, the Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. Tevi Troy, welcome to Think Twice.
Thanks. I always like to think, so thinking twice is even better.
Very good. Well, Tevi, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you, in your capacity as a presidential historian, to place in perspective some remarkable events that we've witnessed in recent weeks. Let's begin by noting the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. Can you tell us about any precedents in which there were attempts on lives of major party candidates? I mean, one springs to my mind, which is the shooting of Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. But can you give us any examples and how they impacted the outcome of those elections?
Yeah, Roosevelt is the best analogy because Roosevelt was a former president who was running again. He was also in Milwaukee, which is the site of the Republican National Convention. And he also did the defiant thing afterwards, meaning the bullet hit his chest, but he had the speech, which is 50 pages, folded in his pocket. That saved his life, stopped the bullet from penetrating deeply, although it did pierce his skin. And he then went and gave his speech saying it takes more than that to stop a bull moose. So that really is analogous to the Trump fist moment.
Yeah.
But I also...
TR didn't have the Secret Service agents, dragging him off. Because if they did, then he wouldn't have been able to continue the speech.
Robert F. Kennedy, not an ex-president, but former Attorney General, former sitting senator, and brother of an assassinated president, who was on the trajectory to win the Democratic nomination, probably win the 1968 election, and he was killed in June by a Palestinian terrorist. It was really the first incidence of Palestinian terrorism in the West, and people often, paper it over for some reason, but it was really a terrible thing.
Yeah, Sirhan really perhaps altered the course of American history. We don't know if Bobby Kennedy actually would have beaten Hubert Humphrey at the Democratic Convention in Chicago that summer, but who knows? Yeah,
my bet is he would have. But also, I just don't think people talk about this Palestinian terrorist murdering a senior American politician who could have been president.
Yeah, but either way, I mean, these are remarkable events. They don't happen. This doesn't. It's not supposed to happen. But sometimes it does. Fate intervenes. As it happens, TR did not win that election because the Republican vote was split in 1912 between him and his...
I have a problem with TR in this particular race, and I don't like the use of passive voice there. The Republican vote was split because TR split it. He ran against his friend and chosen successor, William Howard Taft. Then he loses at the convention, so Taft gets the nomination. And then, being a sore loser, Roosevelt says, I'm still going to run anyway, splitting the vote and then allowing Woodrow Wilson, who was a horrible president, to become president. So Teddy Roosevelt also altered the course of American history, and not in a good way.
Yeah, that's a very, very fair point. Wilson, he had his... he was sort of lionized, I think, by a generation of sort of Democratic historians. But now we have good reason to sort of rethink it, not the least for, some of his expansion of the federal government as well as his racism. So,
yeah, and his lack of belief in free speech. And he had this committee on public integrity that suppressed speech. He didn't do anything about the Spanish flu. I mean, he was a terrible, terrible president. And I think you're right to say Democratic historians, if he did not have a D after his name, he would have been known as one of the worst presidents ever for a century. And wouldn't have to wait until the George Floyd riots of 2020 to suddenly acknowledge that he was a bad president.
Yeah. Let's talk about the other, and I think in some ways equally remarkable event in terms of, sort of the history of presidential elections, which was the recent debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which not only was the earliest of the presidential debates, and I think it was unlike any that we have ever witnessed before in terms of confrontations between major candidates. These debates, the first one was in 1960, but they didn't start regularly until 1976. We've never witnessed anything like Biden's performance, as well as the reaction from his own party after it. Is there anything that is comparable in our history, in American history, to sort of the events of the last month as far as that debate and what followed?
There really isn't. I mean, people talk about Richard Nixon and his so-called bad performance in the 1960 debates, and he clearly didn't look as good on TV as Kennedy did. He was sweaty and jowly and had the 5 o'clock shadow, but he was mentally on top of his game, and people who listened on radio thought Nixon did a pretty good job. And then you have Jack Kemp in the 96 debates is just destroyed by Al Gore, in part because he didn't really use his briefing books enough and didn't want to put the hard work in. He said something like, I don't need to prepare to face off against Al Gore. And he was just wrong. Gore was a good debater, and Gore really took it to him. But that wasn't presidential. That was vice presidential. Dan Quayle had that really bad moment when he was running for vice president of the, I knew Jack Kennedy.
When Lloyd Benston, sort of called him out.
So, there have been some bad moments, some embarrassments, but there was no constant takedown, just humiliation like Biden suffered against Trump. Not only was Biden just awful and out of it and not on top of his game, but Trump was more restrained than Trump usually is. And clearly somebody had told him and showed him tapes of the 2020 debates when Trump was really out of control and said, you got to rein it in. And he did rein it in, and it really highlighted Biden's infirmities.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting part about it. I mean, I've watched all these debates through the course of my adult life. I've covered some of them. I was actually in the spin room after one of the debates in 96 when Clinton debated Bob Dole in one of the most boring debates in the history. Indeed, Bob Dole, great man in many ways, but one of the most boring presidential candidates we've ever had. And I can tell you that in that spin room, the people who were spinning were also bored, but... I can tell a great spin room story, actually. Okay.
And it actually has relevance to this year. I was in the spin room for Mitt Romney in 2012, and he really beat up Obama in that first debate. It's not as well remembered because Obama rallied in the next two, and Obama eventually won the election. But I was one of the Republican spinners, and we have these red placards that I still have that show what's the name of each person. And the Republicans came out early, ready to go and talk to the reporters. And the Democrats were absent for a really long time because they didn't know what to say because the debate was so bad. And I saw this again. If you looked at the coverage of the spin room after the Biden-Trump debate, the Democrats were really late to enter the party.
Yeah, well, they didn't have much to talk about. I can tell you in that debate that I covered, that I was in the spin room, what I remember was, again, how bored the spinners were. I remember Christine Todd Whitman, who was then the governor of New Jersey, one of the people who were supposed to be arguing for Dole, at one point just sort of looked aside and she asked me if I knew the score of a hockey game, which she seemed more interested. And then the other two things I remember from that was Joe Lieberman, who was spinning for the Democrats, met his his close friend, the late Joe Lieberman, met his close friend, Senator Connie Mack from Florida, a Republican who was there to talk for Dole. And they embraced, and I was standing next to Lieberman, and he said to him, "Would you like to switch sides?"
Right.
And they both laughed because neither of them had much to say. And the other thing I'll remember, just because it's such a funny memory, one of the Democratic spinners that night was Howard Dean, the governor of Vermont. This is some 8 years before he had a brief but memorable presidential candidacy, the famous Scream. And no one in the press wanted to talk to him that night. And he was standing alone with some kid who was holding his sign, as you said, the spinning sign. And the kid was waving the sign desperately, and no one came over to talk to him. But again, funny stories from presidential debates. Not so funny for Biden, to go a little deeper in that story, is that another, what I think is an unprecedented event, is the way many Democrats seem intent on dumping Biden after he had already won renomination in the primaries. While angling for the nomination used to occur right up to and certainly during nominating conventions prior to the dominance of primaries and caucuses, which I guess started in the 1960s to elect delegates, I don't think any party has ever before sought to overturn their voters' choice before in this manner, has it? Have they?
Yeah, it's also interesting how you're talking about the voters' choice. I mean, this Democratic primary was not the fairest process. I mean, they worked very hard to push anyone else out of the race. Dean Phillips was mocked and derided, even though he was making a good point. I was actually kind of impressed with him on the campaign trail, even though he's far to the left of where I am. But, you know, he's smart and he's sensible, and he made a good point about Biden's age and infirmity, only to be attacked by the members of the Democratic Party, some of the same people who panicked after the Biden debate and started saying, oh, no, we got to get rid of Biden. Well, maybe you should have had a fair Democratic primary where you let people make the case. You put Biden on the debate stage, and maybe you wouldn't have been shocked by the meltdown that we just saw.
That's very true. They stacked the deck, which is why Robert Kennedy Jr. Is running as an independent, because he saw that there was, no way he could make any headway in the primaries with the Democrats. But still, as Biden is right to say that 14 million people voted, and, they did vote for him. So this is kind of, we've heard a lot about coups in the last several years. This is kind of an attempted coup in the effort to get rid of him, much as they may have very good reason to want to get rid of him.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an attempted coup, but it's sort of rebelling against what was an unfair process that they didn't call out at the time. And then Biden has his awful performance and then suddenly say, oh, well, let's go after him. And, it's not like Biden's been great since then. He's been a little better in his interviews, but, he's still a guy with diminished faculties. He's just not what he was. I mean, look at the video of him in the Paul Ryan debate in 2012 when he kind of took Paul Ryan to the woodshed, which is a shame because I was rooting hard for Paul Ryan that night. And he had all these antics and he was mugging for the camera. And poor Paul Ryan just seemed not to know what to do with him because I guess he was trained to be deferential to the older vice president, and it was a bad strategy.
Yeah, so it was sort of the quintessential, nice guy Republican getting schooled by, a more ruthless politician. But I guess I want to sort of, we've had presidents who seemed infirm or were infirm. We referenced Woodrow Wilson. He was basically flat on his back for the last year and a half of his presidency in 1919 and 1920 after his stroke. And his wife, who's been invoked a lot recently with people criticizing Jill Biden for, her support for her husband staying in the race. But Woodrow Wilson wasn't running for re-election in 1920 when he was so infirm. Granted, in the past, presidential health was not closely reported, or basically even reported at all. Many Americans really didn't know that Franklin Roosevelt couldn't walk at all during the course of his, more than 12 years in the presidency. Is there any precedent for this kind of a controversy where people are actually saying that, well, maybe the 25th Amendment should be invoked?
I think you raised a good point with Franklin Roosevelt, who was really on death's door when he ran a fourth time, an unprecedented fourth term in 1944. And he died not that long after. And Harry Truman had most of Roosevelt's fourth term. So that is one instance. Look, there was a lot of talk about the 25th Amendment with Trump, not necessarily for infirmity, but there were thoughts about his erratic behavior and the January 6th stuff. So the 25th Amendment gets invoked every once in a while. But the fact of the matter is it's never been utilized. And we don't know how it would play out. And it's really it's a weird thing that the president's own cabinet, handpicked by him, would undercut the president and force him out in that way. I mean, I'm skeptical that we'll ever see the 25th Amendment put into deployment.
I guess it would have to take really a catastrophic stroke or something where the president literally was not able to function at all. I guess that's would be the only scenario where it could. I don't think it could ever be invoked. I think you're right, where the president was up and around, but just people thought he wasn't up to it.
Yeah, it's just not going to happen. Also, the power dynamics of the people in the cabinet are something to think about, because the people in the cabinet, their positions could be altered by the invocation of the 25th Amendment, which could force some of them out of power. Some of them may gain power, but some of them might lose power, and it's a very dangerous game to play.
Right. Were there any 19th, Americans are kind of, most Americans don't know much of their history, alas. But was there ever anyone in the 19th century about whom there were worries about his health in this way or age? Obviously, I don't think people didn't live that long in that era. But were there ever any presidents who, I can't think of one myself where there were presidents who had drinking problems. Franklin Pierce, I think, was one who was thought to be basically holed up in the White House, watching the country fall apart, while he was, getting, not quite there, but not quite where this question with Biden, where somebody, age is undoing him.
So I often think of James Knox Polk, who served one term and only one term, and then he left the White House and he died not that long after. And it's not clear why we don't have a medical exam on him. Some people said it was because of exhaustion. He didn't take vacation, and he didn't let his cabinet members take vacation either. But he also might have died for some other causes. So it's just not clear.
Yeah, well, there was never any question that he wasn't in charge while he was president. I mean, he was running a war at that time, albeit long distance, in Mexico, and without sort of immediate the ability to immediately impact the events of the war. But a lot was going on in his presidency, and he was making the decisions. There was no question of anybody else making the decisions.
Right, and he might have died of cholera, which is something that could afflict a healthy, able-bodied person too.
Yeah,
so,
a 19th century ailment. Yeah, for sure.
He was worn out in his presidency.
Okay, well, all right. Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump. Everybody always speaks of him as completely without precedent, and I think that's probably inarguable. There's never been anybody else like him in terms of his background and his personality. As a historian, do you see him as a truly unique figure, both in terms of his rise, his appeal, as well as the attempts by his opponents to do him in, which are as sort of grandiose and as unprecedented as everything about him?
Yeah, of course not. I'm a presidential historian. When I hear the word unprecedented, I go and look for precedents. In fact, I wrote my last book, Fight House, about infighting in the White House, because everyone was saying the infighting in the Trump White House was unprecedented. And as I showed in the book, there was a lot of infighting in a whole bunch of White Houses, starting with the creation of the White House staff. So I don't necessarily buy completely unprecedented. Trump is different, that's for sure. But when you think about the kind of a less refined type fellow who wins 2 terms, is involved in a controversial election, you think of Andrew Jackson, real populist type. I also think a little bit of Ronald Reagan, in that a lot of Trump's appeal came from popular culture and how people knew him from TV and his appearances in a variety of movies, including Home Alone 2. And so that meant that, like with Reagan, when people said, oh, he's fascist, he's horrible, he's Hitler, people said, no, he's not. I know that guy. I watched him on The Apprentice. I watched him in Home Alone 2 or Sex and the City. So the pop culture familiarity is a form of inoculation that served both Reagan and Trump very well. So there are some similarities with other presidents.
That's interesting. Well, he's certainly, there's a Jacksonian populist air about him. And obviously Jackson that a lot of people loved him and a lot of people hated him. We tend to forget, just a political party just grew up, the Whigs, who became ultimately morphed into the Republicans, as just sort of a reaction to Andrew Jackson. Donald Trump didn't create the Democratic Party, but he may well have deranged it. Or much of our popular culture.
He's in the Republican Party too. So,
yes.
Look, but with Jackson, I often think of the story about how he gets an honorary degree from Harvard, and at the time, it was standard practice that you get your honorary degree and you give the speech accepting it in Latin. And Jackson said, of Latin, I only know 3 words: e pluribus unum, which is a real populist way of taking down the elites. And so, I could see Trump doing something like that.
Yeah, well, I can't see him getting an honorary degree from Harvard, though.
Well, it was shocking at the time. John Quincy Adams, whom he had defeated, tried to prevent him from getting the degree.
Yeah, that was kind of a stab in the back to the Adamses. But he had John Quincy Adams had a lot of schmozzle as president, and after that. Let's talk a little bit about vice presidential choices. We're speaking the day where, this will be the week of the Republican convention. We're speaking just after Donald Trump has named his vice presidential nominee, Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio. I think it's a very interesting, just to place it in historical perspective. Presidents don't usually pick vice presidents as in terms of nominating their successors. It turned out that way for some. George H.W. Bush was Reagan's successor, but I'm not sure in 1980, anybody thought that was going to happen. And indeed, if they thought that, probably some people in Reagan's circle wouldn't have gone along with it, and the whole Bush dynasty would never have happened. But this is kind of another unique thing in that we know Trump can only serve one term. And by nominating a young man with, who shares a lot of his positions, he is clearly, and assuming, which, maybe Republicans are doing, obviously, until it happens, it doesn't happen. We don't know who will win in November, but right now the Republicans are favored after everything that's happened in the last month and things before that. It was as if, Donald Trump was deciding whom he wanted the Republicans to be nominating 4 years from now. Are there some precedents for that or some other examples of how it was a conscious decision or seemingly a conscious decision to say, okay, you're going to be the person who carries this on for me?
Yeah, I think we've seen it a little bit in the past. So I mentioned Franklin Roosevelt earlier, and he was on death's door when he was running for that fourth term. And there was a move to get Henry Wallace off the ticket. Wallace certainly had some communist ties. There were people on his staff who were probably Soviet agents. It's not clear exactly what Wallace himself's affiliation is, but suffice it to say, it would have been really bad to have someone that pro-Soviet be the president of the United States in the late 1940s. So there was a move to get him off the ticket, and so there was a sense that Truman might take over. But I don't think the American people voted in 44 thinking, oh, we're voting for Truman.
Yeah, nobody thought Roosevelt was at death's door, as you said before. I mean, they knew nothing about his health, even though the people around Roosevelt saw that he really was dying. I mean, he looked terrible.
Right. So I think of that one. But in general, it's very hard to say this is going to be my successor. Look, Dan Quayle was kind of a next generation candidate under George H.W. Bush. Bush wins the election with Quayle on the ticket, but then loses re-election. Quayle tries twice, 96 and 2000, to run for president and got no traction at all. So, you could say what you want in terms of this guy's going to be my successor, but it doesn't necessarily make it so.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to remember the pick of Dan Quayle, and I don't know that there was a broad assumption that nobody thought of Dan Quayle as a future president. I mean, maybe some people were dreaming on it, whose name was, in his inner circle, but I don't think the speculation about the future was anywhere near or at all the way it is now in the day after Vance was picked.
No, I agree with that. What I'm just saying is that somebody could be the vice president and people assume that, oh, that's the next guy in line. And it doesn't necessarily play out that way because the voters have a say.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. Whoever, there are plenty of other Republicans who have their eye on 2028 right now. But certainly Vance just got the inside track in a way that, the other contenders, whether they're some people who oppose Trump or supporters of Trump, won't. But obviously 4 years, 4 months until November is an eternity. 4 years until 2028 is, light years away. Let's switch to a couple of issues that we obviously pay particular attention to at JNS. First, how do you think Israel and the war on Hamas is impacting the 2024 election? And do you believe that Biden's somewhat equivocal stand on the war against Hamas will hurt him enough with anti-Israel voters to cost him in Michigan, for example, or hurt him with Jewish voters who are unsatisfied, with his stand? And how does the surge in anti-Semitism, which is certainly impacting Jews all over this country, how will that wind up affecting the outcome if it does at all?
Well, I actually think there's a third group, which is the normal American, most of whom are supportive of Israel. We forget that in the midst of the tumultuous pro-Hamas riots that we're seeing on college campuses. So I think the average American is pro-Israel because they're pro-civilization against barbarism, and I think we really shouldn't lose sight of that. The Jewish vote, look, I think Trump may gain some points in the Jewish vote, but as you know well, the Jewish vote's always going to be somewhere between 70 to 80% for the Democrat. I think it's going to be closer to 70 this time, which is a bad sign for the Democrats. But Biden, I think, has managed to mess it up with three key groups. I think a lot of Jews are angry with him for his equivocal stance, as you put it. I think the pro-jihadi vote looks at him and they call him Genocide Joe, which I think is ludicrous. But they're not going to, if you're calling him Genocide Joe, it's not like you're voting for the guy. And then the average American.
They will be at the Chicago convention with the Democrats too, and no doubt get some press there.
Right. And the Democratic convention is probably not going to start with a plea and a prayer to get the hostages free as the Republican convention did. And I was heartwarmed by that. And then there's this third group of average Americans who you just, again, side with civilization over barbarism. And they don't like that Biden is kind of namby-pambying it. Sometimes he's a little pro-Israel, sometimes he's more pro-Hamas. And strategically, it's stupid too, because if you really want a peace deal, if you want the ceasefire, you need Hamas to come along. And every time you criticize Israel, Hamas says, oh, America's just going to get us what we want. So even though you and I may have a different position on Israel than the Biden folks do, I mean, we're to the right of where they are, and we're more pro-Israel than they are. I just think from what they're trying to accomplish, the way they're going about it is bad. So I think Biden is managing to handle the Israeli situation politically as badly as possible.
Yeah, I think the obsession with the Arab American vote, Muslim American vote in Michigan, is curious. They are certainly a voter, they control, they are the deciding factor in elections in Dearborn, Michigan. But as much as certainly 100,000 votes might decide Michigan, the assumption that they're the only votes up for grabs on this issue, as you noted, I think there are far more pro-Israel voters in the center than there are, anti-Israel votes on the left. And the extent to which the Biden administration has sort of kowtowed to to this basically anti-Israel vote. I mean, I find it deeply ironic that the man who said he entered the presidential race in 2020 because of his anger about Charlottesville and the neo-Nazi rally there is basically spent, a lot of time, bending the knee to, basically anti-Semitic voters.
Yeah, and anti-Semitic riots on campuses that are incredibly destructive of public property, and Jews have been killed in some of these riots. So, I think obviously Charlottesville, terrible, right? I mean, I don't stand with white supremacists in any way, shape, or form. But if you're going to call out hate, you got to call out hate wherever it is, even if it's on supposedly your side of the political spectrum. And I don't see Biden doing that, and I don't see senior Democrats doing that, with the exceptions of people like John Fetterman. And I find it really disturbing.
Yeah, certainly not consistently, and not in a way that is sort of taken seriously by the people who are doing the rioting. And it is. I mean, Trump said it in the debate. We've had 1,000 Charlottesvilles in the last year in terms of sort of anti-Semitic demonstrations. But yet that hasn't made quite the same impact as, a couple of hundred neo-Nazis with tiki torches. Bad as they were, and as much as someone did get killed there, somehow that hasn't, impacted the imagination of Americans in the same way. But the question is, has it impacted the imagination of American Jews, who are certainly frightened to death by Charlottesville and the imagery of Charlottesville, especially the torches, because it reminded them of Nuremberg. But, as much as you rightly say, and certainly as I've spent my adult life covering it, Jews are loyal partisan Democrats. And, we are in a hyper-partisan moment in American history where I think religion plays, politics plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives. So people root for their political party the way they root for their baseball teams. It doesn't matter who's on the team. They root for them. And yet, the question is there some movement in the Jewish vote among them, among not counting the minority of Jews who are either Orthodox or politically conservative? Is there any give there, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the Orthodox vote does matter. And demographically, Orthodox Jews are more likely to marry early, more likely to marry other Jews, and more likely to have kids, and more likely to have more kids. So I think over time, there are going to be some shifts. Also, you're seeing some noise by Jewish donors who tend to be pro-Israel, not all of them, but Jewish donors who are uncomfortable with the drift of the Democratic Party and their unwillingness to call out anti-Semitic hate and anti-American hate. You should call it that as well. So those are early indicators, but I still think 70% of Dems are going to vote for the Democrat, and 30% or so are going to vote for the Republican.
Yeah, well, the Republican Jews have been chasing their 39% mark that Ronald Reagan got in 1980. It's been sort of like the phoenix, and I always say that they needed a Ronald Reagan and they needed a Jimmy Carter to run against to duplicate that, and that's never quite happened. But we'll see. Let's talk a bit about your new book about the relationship between the presidency and big business. First, what led you to that specific topic at this moment in time? Obviously there have been a lot of controversies between, moguls and big business since, as you start your book in the aftermath of the Civil War. What made this the moment to write this book?
Well, Jonathan, as you know, a presidential historian, and I often write books, or always write my books on presidents and blank. And the blank is something that nobody has covered before, but also something that has some resonance in the current moment. So I'm trying to use my knowledge of presidential history to teach something about what's going on in American politics and American culture at the time. And what I've noticed recently is that there's this weird phenomenon that both Republicans and Democrats seem to hate big business. And that wasn't always the case. So I decided to look at the history of presidents and CEOs, big name CEOs like Ford, Rockefeller, Gates, Musk, Zuckerberg, going all the way to the current day, and looked at how their interactions with presidents have shaped our economy, shaped our government policies, but also shaped the way the American people look at this relationship with government and big business, and these days not liking either very much.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and that also has to do with the parties kind of changing, exchanging identities in some ways as they react, and the impact of Trump and the impact of sort of how the Democrats are also changing. I think there's a lot of really interesting history in there in your book, as I say, dating back to the post-Civil War era, and I do recommend it. But I want to concentrate in the time that we have to speak about some of the most recent developments. Business has been very powerful in the past, in conflicts between people like Teddy Roosevelt, who we've already spoken about, and the big business, the trust that he tried to break up were epic. But I guess my question is, do you think that the internet oligarchs who control Silicon Valley, are they far more powerful than the moguls of the past, including those like, say, William Randolph Hearst, who control most of the nation's media? The people who control Google, Amazon, and social media platforms aren't just incredibly rich, and they are incredibly rich in ways that, maybe even, the Rockefellers weren't, but they own the public square in a way that no one could in the past. So some of the comparisons to their predecessors on the money end of the power money divide, does it kind of break down because these people have such immense, wealth and power?
I don't think so. First of all, Rockefeller was immensely powerful, and he controlled oil, which was essential to the American economy and American industry at the time. And then you think about someone like Henry Luce, who ran Time magazine. It's true that Time magazine may not have had as many eyeballs as Facebook does today, but it also didn't have as many competitors. His idea, his insight was to create a national magazine that would create the national conversation. You had to be reading Time magazine in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You don't have to be on Facebook today. You could be on Twitter instead. You can be on one of these other platforms. So I think there was a dominance from the lack of competition. Also, you think about guys like the Warners I talk about in their relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. You had so many more Americans going to the movies every week. I mean, and they were putting out propaganda messages through their movies. Now, thank God back then it was usually anti-Nazi and pro-America, which is unlike what Hollywood does today. But they had a lot of power, and they were using it. They're saying, we are going to propagandize through our movies that dozens of millions of Americans are going to every week to get our messages out.
Yeah, well, movies played, occupied the space in our culture that, TV, the internet. I mean, it's, and it had a monopoly in a way. You're right. The company, there was nothing like the movies. I mean, people have far more choices today.
And nothing like the Warners, who were the one studio that really saw this opportunity to propagandize with their movies. I mean, Casablanca, one of my favorite movies, fantastic movie, but it was an anti-Nazi, pro-America movie. I mean, they were trying to put out a specific message for that movie. And Warner Brothers was generating dozens of movies like that constantly throughout the late 30s and 40s. Also very pro-Roosevelt messages. Roosevelt knew that they were kind of appealing to him with the types of movies they were putting out there. So I think they had a huge impact. And so I wouldn't take lightly the comparison between the Moguls of today and the Moguls of yesteryear. I think they all had a lot of power.
Yeah, that's true. I think the ability of, the contemporaries, as I say, the Silicon Valley oligarchs to intervene in politics is enormous, not just in elections, but in terms of their ability to censor points of view. And again, this can harken back to the past when, the movie moguls, the people like the Luces, the Hearst did have the ability to shut down dissent. Obviously, as we learned in the Twitter files, the power and the money seem to be colluding, and what my friend Ben Weingarten has called a censorship industrial complex. How has that? Is this unprecedented, or we've had efforts in the past to shut down dissent too, haven't we?
Sure. I mean, we talked earlier about Woodrow Wilson, and he had the Committee on Public Integrity, which is basically a censorship arm of the U.S. government, and it suppressed conversation about the 1918 flu. Maybe if we had been able to share information from city to city, we would have known what methods worked and what didn't. But Wilson didn't want to have that conversation. He was all about World War I, and he did not want to have people talking about this flu that was killing hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, well, and as well as he was rounding up political dissenters, literally rounding up people who were dissenting in the Red Scare in 1919. So, yeah, I mean, the power. But here, I mean, right now, one of the things that we've been observing, certainly in this election, the changing relationship between business and politics. You spoke before about how today both parties seem to have a grudge against big business, and yet big business is still, they donate a lot. They seek to influence politics. The Democrats have kind of shifted in some ways because they are now sort of the party of the credentialed elites. And I think many people on Wall Street identify more with them than the sort of Wall Street moguls of the past did. That's a cultural change too, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a change. And also the people who are in each party have changed. So when I was in the George W. Bush administration, white, married, college-educated voters, those were our jam. I mean, those were the people who voted Republican. And now college-educated voters don't vote Republican, and you have the non-college-educated who are on the side of the Republicans. So that's only 20 years, and that's been a real shift.
Yeah, I think the two parties have largely exchanged identities. And we've seen some of this, and, as people were remarking that the president of the Teamsters spoke at the Republican convention this week. Now, he isn't necessarily endorsing Trump. He may wind up endorsing him, but, he hasn't yet. But the current Republican Party seems to be more interested, and I would say largely through the influence of Trump and sort of people like J.D. Vance, whom we picked as his vice presidential nominee, who have, harped on that. He's the author of Hillbilly Elegy, talking about the working class that got left behind in the rush towards liberal global economics, under Clinton and Bush and then Obama. That really has sort of shaped our attitudes towards business and how politics looks at this in a very different way. And Republicans are suddenly discovering that working class voters are not being represented by the Democrats, and maybe, the Republicans should.
Yeah, I think you're onto a really good point there with the Democrats, because if you're a member of an industrial union or the Teamsters or something like that, you don't want this transgender stuff in your schools. You don't want anti-American woke ideology. You don't want all kinds of leftist stuff. You don't want gun control. So everything that the left is offering is not something that a member of a non-government union wants. I mean, the government union workers, they're far to the left, but the private sector union workers, they're a different story.
Yeah, and I think it kind of sets up an interesting dynamic. I mean, you traced in great detail the sort of interactions between people like, Zuckerberg and, as I say, the people who control in Silicon Valley and these enormously wealthy moguls and their interactions with, presidents dating back from Bush to Obama and now, Trump and Biden. If there is a second Trump administration, I would imagine that the dynamic with business will be even different from what it was in his first administration. Obviously, business liked some of the things he did. They like tax cuts. They love deregulation. That probably even more than the tax cuts. But big business opposes his stance on tariffs and trade and illegal immigration. Sort of two stands that sort of unions in the past were always against illegal immigration and for sort of protective tariffs to protect American industry. How do you see this, these conflicts developing as we go forward?
Yeah, well, first, you forgot to say that I trace in great but fascinating detail these interactions. But also, I would add that, look, the second Trump term could be very different. We've already seen Elon Musk, who in the first Trump term, he talked to Trump. He was in some a committee that Trump had put together, but he wasn't endorsing Trump. In this term, he's full-on endorsed Trump, and he's donating massively to a Trump super PAC. So yeah, I think,
and his wealth is based in no small measure, and you talk about it in your book on the government help that his businesses got.
Yeah, SpaceX also and Tesla both got a lot of not only government subsidies but government encouragement. Obama went down to see Musk at SpaceX, which was a huge boost to him. So, but then when he became this free speech advocate, suddenly the Democrats weren't so comfortable with him, and they turned on him hard. And the Biden administration's been investigating his various businesses from a variety of ways, from the EPA and FTC and Department of Labor. So if you don't stay in the government's good graces, they can come after you also.
Yeah, I think the Twitter files has had enormous impact. His opening up of the files of the company that he bought. I think it's had impact on our national conversation. And as you say, it might well have impact on his, on the way the Justice Department treats him. Although who knows whether that will, we'll see whether next January he'll still be in the same peril. Well, Tevi, thanks so much for joining us today and for all of your insights. Please, look out for his next book, The Power and the Money. It's worth the time, as well as his other books. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, speaking of Elon Musk, or the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.